Welcome everybody. Welcome to the third lecture of the year. I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Nick Hewitt, who I've been in, I can't remember if we physically met, Nick. We were in phone contact.
We've never physically met, no.
And some of you will remember I interviewed Nick for the podcast. Must have been last year?
Yep.
The year before. Anyway, very delighted to welcome him today. I actually got a message from someone earlier saying they couldn't make it and they were particularly sad because they were the ones who recommended I got Nick. So slightly unfortunate, but I'm sure the rest of you are going to enjoy the talk, of course, which is based on his book, and a bit of a historiography that really did need to be filled. Everyone will know that most of the work on D-Day, including my own forthcoming book, is most of it's land-based. So to have the naval aspect and to be reminded that it wasn't just a question of getting the troops there and then resupplying them, it was a question of actually fighting a naval battle for a considerable period of time. It's good that Nick was able to do this. And at the end, Nick, if you can just give us a little bit of a whisper of what's happening next, I'll try and remember to ask you that question. Nick Hewitt.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Good evening. Feels like an appropriate time to be talking about amphibiosity, given that a US Marine Expeditionary Force is somewhere in the Indian Ocean, sculling around with 5,000 Marines on board. So I used to argue with people in the modern Royal Navy who would say that Nelson was very important, but almost everything that happened since was of complete irrelevance to the modern Navy. But actually, I think, hopefully you'll see by the end of tonight, a lot of this stuff is constant. D-Day and Normandy and the naval part in it has been a kind of golden thread running through my entire career. Not quite my first job, but one of my first jobs was the resident historian on board HMS Belfast, which was part of the bombardment forces. In 2011, I joined Portsmouth Naval Base Property Trust, and they gave me a motor gunboat to care for, AIM GB-81, which was part of the screening forces around the Normandy invasion fleet, and they also gave me a German human torpedo to look after, of which more later. In 2014, I made a TV show called D-Day's Sunken Secrets, and I had the extraordinary privilege of diving in a submersible, the wreck of the US troop ship Susan B. Anthony, accompanied by a gentleman called Jim Booth, who was a combined operations pilotage party veteran in his 90s at that point. And that was the first time he'd been in a submersible since June the 5th, 1944, when he was looking at German soldiers on the beach through the periscope of an X-craft. And then in the same year, I joined the National Museum of the Royal Navy, and I was given the huge privilege of managing the restoration of LCT 7074, the last remaining tank landing craft to take part in Operation Neptune, and now on display on Southsea Commons. So I've had a huge involvement, and each of those jobs gave me a sense of perspective on a different aspect of it. And what I came out with at the end of it all, and what pushed me into this book really, was the fact that the naval contribution to Normandy is a huge story. It's often been very poorly told. In a lot of books, the sailors are just taxi drivers. They're there at the beginning. You might get a few naval accounts. They put the soldiers on the beach, and then the action rushes ashore with the soldiers, and that's the last thing you hear of the sailors. In this book, I am arguing that the naval operations to secure the Seine Bay beforehand, put the army ashore and then sustain it, and then support it, and keep it there for weeks afterwards, are a naval battle in their own right, a largely forgotten one, which I christened the Battle of the Seine Bay. It's what I wanted to call the book, but my publishers wouldn't let me. But the title does seem to be catching on. So a key question, as with any author, Saul will confirm this, is when to start. You can easily argue that almost everything the Allied navies did in the Western theatre, at least, ultimately was geared at putting an army back into Northwest Europe. But for me, it really starts with the early conferences. Casablanca in January 1943 is the moment when I chose to start. That's when they decide to establish Cossack, which is famously the planning staff for the liberation of Europe without a commander, without a plan, without any forces. They established a planning staff led by a remarkable gentleman called Lieutenant General Sir Frederick Morgan, who deserves much more attention than he gets. Morgan and his team whittled down the various options. They presented the Normandy plan at the Quebec Conference in August 1943. And at Quebec, it was determined that the liberation of occupied Europe, Operation Overlord, would begin with a naval assault landing Operation Neptune in Normandy in early May at that point. and then there was going to be a simultaneous landing in southern France. And that for me is the go button. But for the sailors, it starts a bit earlier than that. And I thought it was important in the book to look briefly at operations in the Channel from around January 43 up to the very eve of D-Day, which really made the Channel a safe operating environment for that enormous and very vulnerable fleet. Not every operation was conceived as an enabling operation for Normandy. Most sailors had no idea that there was any connection, but indirectly almost everything helped. What these operations allowed the Allied navies to do, and at this point they were mostly British and Canadian, the Americans come late. No, I'm not saying anything more about that. It enabled them to establish a qualitative and a quantitative superiority over the German naval forces in the Channel. And that would be a vital factor in ensuring success in June 1944. And this action here, almost unheard of, the Battle of the Bay of Biscay, December 43, is a really good example of this work. The cruisers Glasgow and Enterprise intercepted a force of 11 German destroyers, sank 3, drove the others off, many damaged. These are kind of the run-of-the-mill business as usual for the Navy at this point. They're not defensive. The first 2 years of the war, essentially in home waters, the Royal Navy is operating defensively. I wrote a book about that as well called Coastal Convoys. By this point, they're going out and they're looking for trouble. And this chapter in the book is really about the trouble that they find and how they win. Sailors are intimately involved in planning at all levels, first with Cossack and later with Eisenhower's SHAEF, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. Admiral Sir Bertram Ramsay, of whom I am an enormous fan, if you read the book you will see, was appointed on the 25th of October 1943, actually before Eisenhower, because the naval side of it is going to be so complex and so difficult to put together. The photo here shows Ramsay with Sir Philip Vian on the right, who was the Eastern Naval Task Force commander for the British beaches, something of a naval celebrity. Became very famous in 1940 when he took his destroyer Cossack into the Norwegian fjords and liberated captured merchant sailors from the Altmark. And on the left is Eisenhower's deputy, Air Marshal Arthur Tedder. Ramsay's task was made far harder when Eisenhower and Montgomery were appointed. They looked at the Cossack plan and they concluded that it was on too narrow a front and didn't involve enough troops. And they expanded the landings to 5 divisions from 3, and they added 2 new assault areas. Now, if you're a soldier, that's a really easy thing to do. You just wave a wand and you add 2 divisions from the many divisions that you have assembling in Britain or in the Mediterranean or in other places. It's a huge, huge headache for the Navy. You have to expand the fleet to deliver those soldiers and to protect that greatly expanded invasion area. Ramsay took it on the chin. He recorded in his diary, following a 5th of January meeting with Montgomery and Lee Mallory, I pointed out that the costs of what this implied and that the bill must be met by the Admiralty for increased force. And he just got on with the job. Initially, they paid that bill by deferring the proposed date for Neptune by a month, from 1st of May to 1st of June. What that essentially does is get another month's worth of production of landing craft. That's how fine an edge this is. We tend to think of the resources available to the Western Allies by 1944 as almost infinite. They are not. So that extra month of production is incredibly important. And then it gets moved again to a final window of 5th, 6th or 7th of June, which is the best compromise between a low tide to allow the assaulting troops to see, avoid and neutralise obstacles, and sufficient light to allow effective bombardment. They get additional naval assets from the Americans, who reluctantly agree to defer Operation Anvil on the south of France. Anvil is deferred because there simply isn't enough assault shipping to do it at the same time. It's a huge political football. The Americans are extremely angry, see it as a political conspiracy to keep the British in the Mediterranean, because they always think the British want to stay in the Mediterranean. And Admiral Ernest King, the US Chief of Naval Operations, who really just wants to do the Pacific, belatedly does supply additional warships for bombardment support. So originally the Royal Navy was going to do all of Neptune, but this expansion is just a step too far. The expanded Neptune was planned down to the minutest detail incredibly quickly, and sometimes worth reflecting on that given how long it seems to take us now to do things. Montgomery, Ramsey and Lee Mallory issued the initial joint plan on the 1st of February 1944. Ramsey's only been appointed in October, the end of October. The Naval Outline Plan followed on the 26th of February, so he does his bit in 26 days. And this was turned into huge sets of orders running into around 1,000 pages for every commanding officer of a ship, from battleships to LCTs like the one I restored in Portsmouth. And these were broken down into sections which detailed each phase of the operation in chronological order, beginning with preliminary mine laying, or ON2, and ending with ON21, which was Pluto, the pipeline under the ocean for delivering fuel, and ON22, which was a doubtless gratefully received glossary. These were accompanied by corresponding sets of orders from task force commanders and lower commanders. So every commanding officer gets this monumental volume of material. And just to make matters worse, they're constantly being amended. So then they get the corrections. And then they have to, bearing in mind, in theory, most of these orders are restricted to commanding officers' eyes only. Most commanding officers with the experience and the confidence bring someone else into the fold, and I've got some quite good accounts of that. Usually at least their coding officer, their cipher officer, but others as well, because they just can't do this. They have to go through all the orders and correct everything multiple times, finally until the 12th of May, and on the 12th of May the orders are frozen. That's it, there will be no more changes, no more corrections. The task is deceptively simple, and this is slightly paraphrasing, but it really is this simple, is the way it's spelt out in the orders: to break the crust of the German defences and land the assault formations, and then continue without delay the supply and the reinforcement of the army. It sounds really easy, doesn't it? The British assault formations would be landed by Vian's Eastern Naval Task Force, Royal Navy subordinates Rear Admiral Arthur Talbot for Force S in the Sword area, Commodore Cyril Douglas Pennant for Force G in Gold, Commodore Geoffrey Oliver, Force J, Juno, and Rear Admiral William Parry, Force L, the British initial follow-up. The Americans were led by Rear Admiral Alan Kirk as Commander Western Naval Task Force, with US Navy subordinates Rear Admiral Don Moon for Utah, Rear Admiral John Hall for Omaha, and Commodore Campbell Edgar for the US initial follow-up. These are an incredibly experienced team. Saul kindly gave me an in to promoting my latest project. My latest project is the Mediterranean landings, in which I intend to argue that these are not a politically motivated waste of time that the British have conspired about to keep their forces away from Northwest Europe. They are an essential classroom where all of these individuals and many, many more, right down through the fleet to the lowliest sailors on the deck, have learnt their trade, first with Operation Torch in North Africa, which could have been an absolute disaster. So much goes wrong with Torch, you wouldn't believe. But it's against negligible opposition, working through Sicily, Italy. They really know their job. This is an experienced and very highly qualified team. The assault forces were accompanied by allocated units for minesweeping and bombardment, and then subdivided into smaller groups, each of which was assigned a particular sector, and then within each sector were a number of colour-coded beaches. The plans were informed by an incredibly detailed intelligence picture drawn from a complex range of sources, including ultra-decrypts, very well known, human intelligence, notably the French resistance, aerial reconnaissance, which is a hugely overlooked area, and covert beach surveys by people like Jim Booth to establish things like the consistency and the gradient of the beaches that they're going to land on. And they do this all along the occupied European coast. You can't just focus on Normandy, because then the Germans will work out where you're coming. So everywhere from the North Cape of Norway to the Spanish frontier is getting looked at. Sailors played their part in all of this, as they did in the deception operations, Fortitude North and Fortitude South, but I haven't got time to talk about that one tonight. You'll have to read the book to learn about those. The biggest challenge is finding ships. They carried out extraordinary efforts to assemble the fleet, which included everything from specialised assault shipping like this landing craft to put the troops ashore, warships to provide gunfire support, headquarters ships to organise everything, troop ships converted from ocean liners, tugs, floating workshops, kitchens, freighters of all shapes and sizes. Eventually, Neptune would require more than 7,000 ships and assault craft. of all sizes, including 1,213 warships. 79% of them were British or Canadian. 7,000 ships and vessels. It's absolutely staggering. They either built them for the purpose, they transferred them from other theatres, notably the Mediterranean, or they converted them from other craft. There were never enough landing craft. It was always done on a shoestring. And in particular, there were never enough of the versatile landing ships tank, which were the biggest assault craft that could directly beach. While they're pulling together the ships, they're pulling together sailors. By 1944, for the Royal Navy at least, the need for sailors to deliver Neptune meant that almost all the new recruits to the Navy were going straight into combined operations. And they were doing an incredibly narrow, focused training that's basically gearing up to training people to drive landing craft. So, for instance, they start to dispense with deep water navigation because they're not going to need to know how to do that. They're going to need to follow another landing craft alongside another one and go across and put your craft on a beach. So they strip it right down to the bare bones. After completing their basic training, they then get trained at special centres all over the UK, combined operations training centres from Hayling Island on the south coast, which is one big training camp for combined ops, up to the Highlands of Scotland. Combined ops training was incredibly hard. They're basically training these guys to be commandos. They're getting run over the Highlands in foul weather in the middle of winter. Much, much harder than this slide of, what they call a happy snap, beautifully posed picture of sailors doing signals training somewhere on a beach. Peter Bird was one of the people I looked at for the book. He trained at HMS Loch Ilot near Fort William, where lessons on signals and seamanship and naval history were combined with boxing, assault courses, cross-country runs and swims across the River Ilot in the middle of winter. One particularly sadistic PTI made the trainees climb a rope and cross a roof girder 4 metres above the ground in a Nissen hut. And this is Peter Bird's words. He used to shout the naval order still, then everybody must absolutely freeze, nobody must move until that's been corrected. So when we got on this girder, a whole class of us, about a dozen, he used to shout still and wait there till the first man dropped off, and then we were allowed to proceed. If they passed, the trainees then went on to learn how to operate landing craft, then they joined their units and they practiced as formations. On the other side of the Atlantic, thousands of young Americans were doing the same thing, most of them at the US Navy's absolutely vast amphibious training base at Solomon's Island in Maryland. Finally, as many soldiers, sailors and airmen as possible took part in huge combined arms training exercises, pre-invasion rehearsals, involving entire assault forces. The final full-scale invasion rehearsal was known as Operation Fabius, involved forces S, G, J and O, all doing their own training or their rehearsal at the same time. Essentially, it's a D-Day in miniature, 6 entirely separate exercises stretching from Weymouth to Littlehampton. Force U, the American assault group going into Utah, have a slightly different experience. Force U had been added late. It was one of Montgomery's and Eisenhower's additions. Its final assault area was geographically separate from the rest of the Normandy beaches, so they got their own rehearsal, codenamed Operation Tiger, Exercise Tiger, which has become perhaps rather well known for all the wrong reasons. On the night of the 27th, 28th of April, one of the convoys of LSTs crossing Lyme Bay to the assault beach at Slapton Sands was attacked by German fast motor torpedo boats known as E-boats. 2 precious LSTs were sunk. That's catastrophic. 2 more were badly damaged and 749 US servicemen were killed. The image shows LST-289 coming back into Dartmouth. Tiger vividly illustrated that the Germans remained a clear and present danger if they had a little luck. We're hearing a lot these days about asymmetric warfare. The asymmetric person only has to get lucky once, and you've caused a really significant problem. Those Germans weren't looking for an invasion convoy. They were on a routine patrol looking for coastal shipping. Unfortunately, they didn't know what they'd hit. Neptune officially began at 23:30 on the 25th of May. That's when everybody finally got to open the final version of the sealed orders, and the military holding camps in southern England were frozen. They were locked down at that point. After an unseasonal summer gale, which we've all heard about, caused a tense delay for 24 hours, the Armada finally set off on the night of 5th, 6th of June. By this point, Jim Booth has been sitting in an X-craft since the 4th. So it's getting very interesting atmospheric inside that boat. Each force passed along the coast, then they turned out into the channel. Most of them passed near to Area Z. I haven't got a pointer, annoyingly, but you can see the circle there. Which was a large patch of water near the Isle of Wight, nicknamed Piccadilly Circus. There's a myth that they assembled at Area Z. Area Z was not an assembly area. You couldn't put 7,000 ships in that patch of water. They all kind of passed near it. Area Z becomes really important in the follow-up phases. It would later be buoyed with a big buoy with a Z on it, hence Area Z. And from here they passed down their marked and mine-swept channels into the assault areas. The minesweepers went first. Sweeping and marking this huge stretch of sea was fraught with danger. Again, minesweeping, very much on everybody's minds at the moment, isn't it? That's what everybody wants everybody else to do, by the sounds of it. Neptune was in history's biggest minesweeping operation. It was vast. The British Naval Staff History lists 255 sweepers. I'm not entirely sure it's correct. Some sources list more than that. Their task was fourfold. They first of all had to clear 2 channels through to each assault area. Then they had to sweep the big stretched patches of water where the bombarding ships would manoeuvre and where the larger landing ships would discharge their landing craft. Then they had to join all those swept channels up into a single big channel, which became nicknamed the Spout, and then they had to keep it clear for the rest of the operation. So their work does not stop on the 6th of June. They're doing this every single night. They were also expendable. And again, this is an account from a chap called Richard Cooper, who served on a motor minesweeper, MMS, which were nicknamed Mickey Mouses by the sailors. When a Mickey Mouse explodes a mine, that is when the sweeper explodes the mine, not the sweeping gear, is something to behold. 1 second, there's a boat with a crew of 20, some of whom you know reasonably well, and then there's nothing except a big pall of very black smoke and a tiny bit of debris floating on the sea. What happens next is the coffin ship, who had been trailing 2 miles astern, comes up and takes the place of the departed, and you carry on as if nothing had happened. When the US Navy's minesweeper Osprey struck a mine at 1759, caught fire and sank, the 5 sailors and 1 officer who died became Neptune's first official deaths in action. Not paratroopers, it's sailors. The Neptune bombardment plan was incredibly complex. It divided German defences into 4 categories. Heavy coastal defence batteries with big guns, which could actually threaten the fleet at sea, were the top priority. Followed by smaller batteries in concrete bunkers, batteries in the open, and then the beach defences, which threatened the soldiers, so pillboxes, machine gun posts, that kind of thing. These defences would be dealt with by a combination of air and sea bombardment. And although I'm talking mostly about the sea tonight, it's important not to forget that there's a huge air contribution to the bombardment. Strategic bombing began well in advance of D-Day, but again, they couldn't just focus on Normandy. They had to hit targets everywhere to avoid giving away the location. The attacks on Normandy specifically reached a crescendo on the night of 5th of 6th of June, when heavy bombers dropped 100 tons of bombs on each of 10 major coastal batteries. Medium bombers pounded 6 more, and more bombers returned to assist in drenching the beach defences. At sea, each assault area had an allocated naval bombardment force. Once in theatre, the flag officers commanding the bombarding ships would be under the command of the assault force commanders. This is a big deal for the Navy, which is an intensely hierarchical organisation. The flag officers in command of battle squadrons are very, very senior naval officers indeed. The upstarts who are commanding assault formations, who've done all this work in the Mediterranean, are not. But everybody accepts it without a qualm. Each heavy ship was allocated its own bombardment berth, and it was given a bearing and a distance to steam from a light buoy laid by the minesweepers. This is meticulous stuff, all reconnaissanced in advance and planned in advance. Each bombardment force could draw on Spitfire and Seafire spotting aircraft, and later on teams of forward observers ashore. Main and subsidiary targets for the initial bombardment were allocated well in advance. Big ships were given coastal batteries. Some smaller warships were also given targets, but most were given the discretion to kind of carry out opportunity fire because they could see what was actually going on the beaches. Shortly before the assault, this is at the last minute, smaller warships and fire support landing craft, which are converted landing craft, would close in and carry out what they called drenching fire. They would smother the beach with all the steel they could put on it to give the soldiers the maximum cover in the last minutes and the moments when they're at their most vulnerable when they're coming into the beach. Utah Beach in the west was the earliest H hour. Almost complete surprise appeared to be achieved in this sector, wrote Ramsay. Assault waves were generally landed on time and against only slight enemy opposition. The naval staff history went further, referring to the comparative feebleness of the enemy opposition. That the Navy doesn't do itself any favours. There's a famous tradition of understatement in the Navy, and one of the reasons I think why Neptune has been overlooked and why the Battle of the Same Bay has been overlooked is the Navy goes to great pains to make it look like it was all business as usual, nothing went wrong and it's all fine. Utah is relatively easy compared to what happened elsewhere, but it wasn't a pushover. The US destroyer Corrie was lost after it was hit by shore fire, 10 killed, 14 injured. PC-1261, which was the control vessel for Red Beach, was sunk by a shell. 22 of 65 were killed. With that ship lost, it was a marker, the entire invasion at Utah drifted slightly to the left, and eventually they landed about 2,000 metres southeast of where they should have been. This is a blessing in disguise, actually, as it turns out, because the defences were less formidable in that area. Moving on to Omaha, more has been written about Omaha, I suspect, than perhaps any other aspect of Neptune Overlord. Its story has been told and retold in documentaries and in works of fiction, notably Spielberg's epic Saving Private Ryan, which for the record I love, but I do actually. I don't really have an issue with no British soldiers being on Omaha Beach. There aren't any British soldiers on Omaha Beach. I do have a massive issue with that movie's absence of American sailors. The Navy are invisible, largely, again, once Tom Hanks is safely ashore. Omaha was saved from becoming a disaster, yes, by the determination of ordinary GIs crawling up the bluffs and the inspirational leadership of their officers, but it was also saved by the landing craft crews, many of whom were British, actually. An awful lot of Americans were delivered to Omaha by British crews. And naval bombardment, which is by the US Navy destroyers who were operating perilously close inshore, almost running aground at various points, being directed by soldiers on the beach, pointing at things for them to shoot at. This was absolutely instrumental. The Navy was shooting the soldiers up those bluffs. At one point, everywhere the destroyer skippers improvised. USS Karmic relied on friendly troops as spotters. They were watching what they were shooting at and then firing the big guns at what they were shooting at. USS Emmons, another destroyer, acted as a spotter for the battleship Arkansas, directing her 12-inch gunfire by firing spotting rounds. At one point, Arkansas was firing 12-inch rounds up one of the drawers just in front of the assaulting troops. At the end of the day, the USS Doyle, as an example, reported expending 2,359 rounds of 5-inch, 558 rounds of anti-aircraft ammunition, and 156 shells filled with coloured dye used for reporting the fall of shot. It's hard to imagine there was very much left in her magazines. General Omar Bradley, commanding US First Army, generously acknowledged in his memoir what had marked the difference between success and failure at Omaha when he wrote, "The Navy saved our hides." All three British and Commonwealth beaches were broadly successful, but again, none of them were easy. And there has been a particularly irritating tendency to describe the British beaches as easy. Max Hastings in Overlord, for example, gives them less than 9 pages collectively for all the British beaches. Sword Area famously saw the only direct intervention by the German Navy when 3 big fleet torpedo boats came out of Le Havre, penetrated the smokescreen on the eastern flank and fired 17 torpedoes into the invasion fleet, sinking the Norwegian destroyer Svenne with the loss of 33 sailors. This is often the only naval action to appear anywhere in some books about D-Day. And bizarrely, it's often used as a shorthand for nothing much happened, really. This is the only thing that happened. Isn't it exciting? But that's it. It sort of implies the absence of genuine peril, and it's hugely annoying. The best way to illustrate how inaccurate this is to provide a couple of case studies. At Jig Beach in Gold Area, Lieutenant Commander Arnold Nyberg's 28th LCT Flotilla, carrying specialist tanks operated by the Royal Engineers, landed under heavy fire from a German strongpoint enfilading the beach at Le Hamel. Nyberg was embarked in LCT 886. When he beached, German gunners started to pour fire into the craft. A shell hit the bridge, knocking Nyberg out, killing 2 soldiers and wounding several more men. In swift succession, more 50mm shells exploded in 886's engine room, wardroom and forward winch shelter, causing more casualties and completely disabling the craft. 2 ensigns were shot away, Nyberg wrote in his subsequent report, with a Nelsonic flourish which justified the 3 we flew. Helplessly, 886 drifted broadside onto the beach, was holed by mines and only managed to offload her tanks at 1400. LCT 749 was also hit several times. Our cargo was disembarked without serious problems, recalled her commanding officer, Lieutenant Jack Booker, due largely to our anchor winch controller, Stoker Mountain, how great is that, who stood by his winch, totally unprotected from bullets and shrapnel, slowly easing 749 up to the beach during the half hour or so it took to offload our tanks. In Sword Area, LCT 947 unloaded one of its Sherman flail tanks, but as the second drove over the ramp, it was hit by 2 mortar bombs, slewed round and blocked the ramp. The explosion ignited explosives which the Royal Engineers on board were carrying, strapped to their tanks. There was a huge secondary explosion which killed the commanding officer of 5th Assault Regiment Royal Engineers and 2 of his men. A further 7 were wounded. 2 Churchill tanks which were next in line were damaged. There's a particularly graphic account of that by a war correspondent called Lambton Byrne. The first follow-up waves, Force L for the British and Force B for the Americans, are assault loaded, and they're still coming into what is basically a hot environment. This is where you get to Susan B. Anthony, which was the ship that I was lucky enough to see underwater. She was a 16,000-ton transport and mined when she arrived with the first personnel convoy of Force B. The ship sank. Fortunately, all the troops on board from the US 90th Division were safely evacuated. The National Museum of the Royal Navy's LCT 7074, my little baby, arrived in Gold Area with Force L at 9:30 on the 7th of June. Sub-Lieutenant Philip Stevens, the first lieutenant, who, like the CO, John Baggott, was 19 years old, and neither of them, as far as we know, had ever been to sea before in their lives. They had like 6 to 8 weeks training, and then they were given something that was basically a big brick with minimal seakeeping qualities and told to drive it to Normandy. It's pretty remarkable. He left a written account, Stevens. Congestion on the beach meant 7074 didn't actually get ashore until 09:30 on the 7th. She collided with another ship on the way in, which cost her guardrails, and then one of the 7 embarked Stuart light tanks drowned in the surf, the crew being collected by a duck. Immediately after offloading, 7074 was swept into a tangle with 2 other landing craft, wrecking the ramp before they drove hard onto the beach right alongside Nyberg's 886, which at this point, and I know this because we have a photo, has all looters will be shot written on the side of the wreck. In a pool left by the receding tide, wrote Stevens eloquently, there floated the body of a soldier, mute witness to the battle which had raged to secure the beachhead. The second key objective, as we talked about, was to commence and continue without pause their reinforcement at as high a rate as possible. The objective is to build up the armies in Normandy faster than the Germans can build up their armies, despite the fact that the Germans have access to the entire European road and rail network, whereas the Allies are bringing everything by sea. Essentially, the invasion force provides all those services that an army would normally expect to have in a rear area. So your workshops, your hospitals, your maintenance facilities, your supply dumps, your ammunition dumps, your heavy artillery is all afloat at this point. This is a significant challenge. We tend to get distracted by the fact that the road and rail networks are under attack from the air and the resistance. It doesn't matter. There is a lot of road and rail arteries into Normandy. The Germans should have had an enormous advantage. After the follow-up waves, the aim was to deliver 8 mercantile convoys a day, plus a conveyor belt of LCT convoys that are just shuttling backwards and forwards, codenamed Starlight by night and Blue Sky by day. There's an entire complex infrastructure of linked acronyms created to keep them flowing. So you get BUCO, the Build-Up Control Organisation, which tried to match the shipping to the military priorities. This is going to be slightly death by acronym, but I'll be as quick as I can. TURCO is the Turnaround Control Organisation. What that does is get the shipping to the ports as efficiently and effectively as they can. Over in the Seine Bay, there are two incredibly overworked naval officers, the captain northbound sailings and the captain southbound sailings, who ensure that the convoys arrive, are unloaded in the right place, turned around and sent back to the UK as quickly as possible. Both of those individuals were assault force commanders. There is a lot of multitasking in this force. So they take off their assault force commander hat and they become captain northbound sailings. COREP, the Control Repair Organisation, was an on-the-site repair organisation that could repair landing craft on the beach, turn them around and get them moving again as quickly as possible. The ferry craft are absolutely vital. Not everything can beach. You have to get stuff from the bigger ships offshore onto the beach. And that's where you get these things. Rhino ferries on the left, which are basically a powered raft. Ducks, the famous amphibious trucks in the middle. And then the LSTs on the right, the most important of all. Again, the largest beaching craft. Initially, they're quite nervous about beaching LSTs. They think their backs are going to break. But the backup becomes so enormous. Eventually, Ramsay just says, put them on the beach and let's see what happens. And they're absolutely fine. More sailors are hard at work ashore, like the Royal Navy Beach Commandos, who were part of tri-service beach groups. These are traffic cops. They're basically, their job is to get on the beach and get everything off the beach as soon as it arrives. Basically to chivvy sometimes reluctant soldiers who want to stop and have a cup of tea and a cigarette and get them off the beach and out of the way so the next load can come in. The assault areas contain no major ports, just a few tiny fishing harbours. That's kind of the point. They realised after Dieppe in 42, taking a port would be virtually impossible. Although even the little harbours were pressed into service. Instead, the invasion took a pair of prefabricated harbours with it. Mulberry could be the subject of an entire paper on its own, so please forgive me. I'm not going to talk a lot about it. The first element were gooseberry breakwaters formed from scuttled block ships. And actually, there was a gooseberry breakwater off every beach, not just where the mulberries were. Each mulberry harbour was the size of Dover. Mulberry A was at Saint Laurent in Omaha area for the Americans, and Mulberry B at Arromanches in Gold. It took about 200 tugs just to bring the components over. And again, if I can have a look, you've got most of the key components. I'm going to try not to disconnect. So this is the scuttled block ships, and then the Phoenix caissoons, which are the biggest breakwater elements. You've got the piers, and then you've got the pier heads, which are two different types, one for LSTs, this is really precarious, and one for normal shipping. By D+10, Mulberry B is operating at 50% capacity, and Mulberry A, the American one, is fully operational. It's fully operational because the Americans cut some corners. They only moored alternate roadway sections and they left an extra entrance in the breakwater. And it was on less stable seabed than Mulberry B. It wasn't just bravado, though. We need to remember the Americans in Omaha were under fire. The situation at Omaha was incredibly precarious and it needed to be reinforced rapidly. So it was a calculated risk. Unfortunately, it was a calculated risk that blew up in their faces when the worst summer storm in living memory swept through the Seine Bay. Winds reached force 7, which is about 56 kilometres an hour. Wave heights averaged 2.5 metres. The storm completely wrecked Mulberry A, badly damaged Mulberry B, and stranded or wrecked 800 ferry craft and a number of larger ships, including this one, HMS Fury, which struck a mine and was then driven ashore. It completely stopped the flow of supplies and had a serious impact on operations ashore. And if ever there was an illustration of how precarious this is, in hindsight it all looks very easy. It was this, that the military started to run out of shells incredibly rapidly when unloading stopped and restrictions start to come in. However, the two Mulberries were cannibalised into one. The salvage crews and COREP performed miracles. By the 22nd of June, the rate of unloading was up to pre-storm levels again. One of the most important reasons for writing the book was to robustly argue that the sailors' battle didn't end on D-Day. And I've devoted 4 chapters to this constant action. I'm not going to do them all right now because I saw the look of fear in your faces then. The flow of supplies was under constant attack once the Germans had recovered from their surprise, and there were a wide range of threats. When we think of the Luftwaffe in Normandy, again from a land-based perspective, we think it's been shot out of the sky and it doesn't exist. At night, the Luftwaffe are out every night, dropping mines in the bay, carrying out torpedo attacks, carrying out bomb runs, sometimes as single tip and run raids, sometimes in larger formations. There are German destroyers, E-boats and all sorts of other small craft in Cherbourg on one side and Le Havre on the other. They come out every night. There are German heavy coastal guns further up the coast that are shelling the invasion area. Sword eventually gets shut down because the shell fire is so intense. Further out there are U-boats trying to get to the spout. And they establish complex interlocking defence lines, basically like a wall down either side of the spout to protect the bay. And the furthest out you have anti-submarine groups. There's an interesting question that comes up every time around D-Day about why aren't the aircraft carriers there? Well, you don't need fleet aircraft carriers there, but actually there are escort carriers, anti-submarine carriers basically out with those groups. Then you have cruiser and destroyer sweeps further in, and then you have basically a line of anchored minesweepers is the last line of defence on the flanks, known as the Trout Line on the British eastern flank. Eventually the problem from E-boats got so intense that Ramsay put in a request through Eisenhower to use the strategic bomber force, which Eisenhower had the power and authority to do, although the bomber barons were not happy about it. Le Havre is completely smashed in this raid. I went to Le Havre last year actually, and the people are still quite ambivalent about it because the city was flattened. However, they sank 3 big fleet torpedo boats, 10 E-boats, and most importantly, they destroyed the Germans' torpedo and mine stocks. But they did rebuild. The E-boats come back after a week or two. They moved them from other places. Again, important to remember that minesweeping never stopped. The Germans are coming in by air every night. They're dropping ground mines at this point. So these are influence mines that sit on the seabed. Apologies for those of you who do know about mining, but I'm going to assume not everyone in the room does. So magnetic mines were anticipated. They basically respond to the magnetic field caused by a big lump of passing steel, a ship. And the damage is done by the shock wave. The mine doesn't bump into the ship. You've got acoustic mines that are activated by the sound of a ship's engine. But then for Normandy, the Germans deploy a new toy, the pressure mine, known as an oyster mine, to the Allies. And that responds to the change in water pressure caused by a passing ship, and it's virtually unsweepable. The only solution they have for oyster mines is to move around very slowly. Time delays or clocks meant that sometimes they had to be swept multiple times before they'd actually go off. And the sweeper crews were incredibly hard work. So by this point, they are doing night duty. They're sweeping in the day, and at night they're on the Trout Line defending against German attacks. They'd very rarely get any sleep at all. The Germans concentrated their mine-laying effort on the American sector at first, and then they moved to the British sector. 25 ships were sunk or damaged by mines in the British area by the 25th of June, 10 warships and 24 other craft lost in the US sector by the 21st. On the 25th of June, an Anglo-American task force was called upon to support the US Army in its assault on Cherbourg. This time the Germans were alerted, and the opposition was incredibly tough. All but one of 7 heavy ships taking part were hit, so were 3 destroyers. The US Navy's Rear Admiral Carlton Bryant, commanding Bombardment Group 2 from the veteran battleship Texas, engaged Battery Hamburg at Furmanville, east of Cherbourg, which had carefully waited until the last minute before opening fire. It gives you an idea of what could have happened on the 6th of June had the Germans been, had the security not been so good. Texas came under heavy fire from the outset. 1 shell penetrated under the port bow without exploding. They had us pretty well pinpointed, Bryant recalled. Having 11-inch shells fired at you is no fun. You can actually see those black specks when they pass over you. They have the most seductive sound, a soft swish, almost a caress. Then when the salvo hits the water, there's the most ungodly smack you've ever heard. Around 13:15, a shell hit the conning tower above Bryant, smashing the bridge structure, killing the helmsman and wounding several others. The destroyers came in for serious punishment, particularly after they adopted a tactic of closing the bigger ships when they were under heavy fire to distract the enemy gunners. On the 5th of July, the Germans deployed a new weapon in the same bay, the Kleinkampfverbände, or small battle units. They'd first used these in the Mediterranean, and they consisted of various types of unpleasant toys, human torpedoes, explosive motorboats, and later midget submarines operating from a base near Le Havre. There was nothing clever about these secret weapons. One author has called them weapons of desperation. They were badly built, and they were manned by poorly trained and incredibly young volunteers, motivated by Nazi ideology and a cocktail of cocaine and amphetamines. The attrition rate was absolutely horrendous, to the point where they were little more than suicide weapons, but they did score some success. Probably the most significant was the old Polish cruiser Dragon, which was sunk by a human torpedo on the 5th of July. Although the crew tried hard to save her, it proved impossible. She was eventually scuttled as part of the Gooseberry Breakwater. The Kleinkampfverbände remained a threat right up to the end of the Normandy campaign. So we get to the end. On the 25th of July, the US Army broke out of the beachhead in Operation Cobra, and the naval war changed. In the west, the Allied armies ranged along the coast, attacking German evacuation convoys, driving the last remnants of the German Navy back into port. The fleet diminished. Most of the Americans and the French ships went to the Mediterranean to support the south of France landing. The eastern flank remained dangerous until the very end, though. I actually chose to end the narrative and the book on the 12th of September, which is when Le Havre, which remained the threat, finally fell. This book had a simple premise. It argues that the campaign fought to seize, exploit and defend the waters around Normandy was not just an overlooked naval battle, but it could perhaps be argued to be the second most important naval battle in the Western theatre, the European theatre, after the Battle of the Atlantic, which enabled it. Defeat in the Seine Bay may have been unlikely, it probably was unlikely, but even a significant setback could have stalled the land battle and prolonged the war for months. And the Great Storm actually is a really interesting illustration of just how quickly things could have unravelled ashore if the Germans had just managed to, say, pause the flow of supplies for a week. That opens the possibility of a negotiated peace and all sorts of other what-if histories. Occasional triumphs by German warships, the submarines and the Kleinkampfverbände, and mining illustrate this only too well. The Battle of the Seine Bay wasn't always overlooked. The writers of the immediate post-war period wrote eloquently of the scale of the naval effort, but their works were compromised by security. There were a lot of things they couldn't say. And they also really wanted to avoid dwelling on anything that went wrong, or more importantly, that the enemy got right. Is that, oh my goodness, that's unexpected. Sorry, that's me. No, that's me. Can you get that back? Yeah. It doesn't matter, it was the last slide anyway. As a consequence, their writing played down any sense of risk associated with the naval campaign, and they brought to pass Ramsay's greatest fear, which was that it was, quote, all easy and plain sailing. So the Battle of the Seine Bay got compressed into one day of tension and a very long exercise in logistics with sailors as taxi drivers and freight haulers. Subsequent writers picked up this trend, and so the naval battle has been gradually airbrushed out. Nothing could be further from the truth. Almost every day, before, during and after D-Day, Allied sailors put their lives on the line. Ships were lost or damaged, protecting those long, fragile supply lines. The British Naval Staff history lists 917 ships and smaller craft lost or damaged during Neptune alone, including 26 warships of varying sizes and another 84 seriously damaged, many of which never returned to service. Some of those are due to weather, obviously, but it doesn't matter. It's all part of the same experience. So that's about 1 in 7 is either lost or very, very seriously damaged. Counting casualties is never an exact science, especially for a campaign that hasn't been coherently studied before. But I estimated that nearly 3,000 US and British sailors died in the Seine Bay, with more from other nations, obviously including Canada, Poland, France and Norway. Imagine if those ships and men had been lost over just a few hours instead of several weeks. Imagine if they'd gone down in the Arctic or the middle of the Atlantic, where it was far harder to recover survivors. Undoubtedly, losses were relatively few, certainly acceptable by the grim logic which applies in wartime. But nevertheless, it is a significant percentage, And in any case, it misses the main point, which is that it was not easy if you were involved either at the sharp end or in a position of authority trying to control events. Every time a ship set off a mine or was torpedoed, most sailors would have wondered if they were next. It surely felt like a battle to them. Thank you very much. Sorry about the phone call. I always forget that calls come through on this thing. The phone is off.
No. I think that was my phone, which is connected at the back. Anyway, never mind. Brilliant, Nick. Thank you so much. Who's got the first question?
Oh, loads. Good. One there, then the one there.
I've got a really, really brief question and a slightly more detailed question.
Go on.
Looking in your book, which is fantastic.
Oh, bless you.
Read it, thoroughly enjoyed it. Hopefully get a signature from you later.
Of course, yeah.
Fantastic pair of images, maps of the assault force in the Solent.
Yes.
Obviously, there are many all the way around the south coast up to Milford Haven.
Yeah.
But just the area of the Solent. 4 or 5 Focke-Wulf 190s took
Yeah.
the Rutter assault force in July 42, and stopped that assault.
Yeah.
Why did the Germans not?
Because they have almost no ability to operate over the UK at this point. It really is that simple. So by this point, they're knocking down every German reconnaissance aircraft that comes over, never mind actual tip and run raiders. They let them look at bits of East Anglia where the Fortitude operations are going on, and no one gets anywhere near Portsmouth. So you're right, it's incredibly vulnerable. The more interesting question is, had the V weapons come along a little bit earlier, that could have been a very different story, because there's lots
Is
of...
it Bradley who makes that, but Bradley or Ike or something, one of the two of them makes that point, don't they?
Yeah.
It might be Ike.
And actually, I'm not an expert on this at all, but I believe that the Germans hold on to the V weapons until the landings have taken place, whereas actually they probably would have been better to use them beforehand. But yes, the Luftwaffe can't get anywhere near, even at night. There are some raids on. In fact, I've got an account in the book. They get into, I think it's Dartmouth where the Americans are, but very briefly and out again very quickly. They can't do anything coherent. Also, that assembly is at the last moment, just before the landings. So, I mean, it's almost like a dome over Portsmouth and Southampton at that point.
The other question, if I will just wait for a second. The minesweeping, it's fascinating to me. Operation Maple, when that was set up, and you've got the British going out to minesweep, they knew where the bulk of the German mines were that had been there since 1942 in the middle of the channel. They found this new bank south of the Solent.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So there was elements that they knew about, but also elements that they didn't. That was one part of it, but then also the teams going out laying mines all the way along the British
Yeah.
to the Havre, to Boulogne, to Calais, to try and block the guys who were sitting there from coming in.
And that's a huge RAF effort. A lot of that's air mine laying, and they're also using coastal forces to do that. So yeah, there's defensive mine laying, there's offensive mine laying by both sides. Both sides have basically got a mine belt to protect their coastal shipping. And when they're sweeping those channels, they're sweeping friendly mines as well. I mean, you're going through all of it to create a route. So it's just a very, very complex operation to try and do that.
Nick, for the uninitiated, can you just explain what happens when you sweep a mine?
Okay. Well, okay. So we have to take them all in turn. Sorry, I'm really sorry, but we'll get to you, I promise. Somebody had to ask this one. So the conventional mine is the tethered impact mine, which is the one that every child can draw every child like me can draw as a cartoon with the spikes. And that's tethered to the seabed, and it floats just slightly below the surface. It has a horn on it, and the ship bumps into the mine, bends the horn, completes an electrical circuit, the mine blows up and knocks a hole in the ship. So you sweep those using a method called oropesa sweeping, which involves streaming wires out to the side of the minesweeper, cutting serrated wires that cut the cable, the mine bobs up to the surface, and then they basically shoot the horn and blow it up. That's how they do those. The acoustic mines are detonated by noisemakers, which sounds terribly sophisticated. The first ones, I'm not sure what they're using by 44, but the first ones are basically a Kango hammer, which is a road hammer, a pneumatic drill that they put in the bow of the sweeper, and it makes a noise and it detonates the acoustic mines. Magnetic mines, there are various mechanisms for sweeping those, but obviously they're using wooden sweepers as much as they can, and trail a device that is basically an electromagnetic field that will detonate the mine. And by 44, early in the war, they have different sweepers for different jobs. By 44, they're mostly all doing all of it. And you have everything from the big fleet sweepers involved in this to converted trawlers to those little Mickey Mouse sweepers which are being churned out of American yards incredibly fast and cheaply. So it's vast, and there's still not enough of them. They even have a relatively small number of sweepers that dated back to the First World War and were coal burning and were nicknamed the Smoky Joes. Everything gets sent to Normandy because there's just not enough. No worries. Hello.
You've spoken about the Allied, the sailors casualties. How do you assess the contribution of the merchant navy, that shadowy throng of men who have perhaps never been fully recognised for their contribution?
So the merchant navy is vast. The contribution is enormous, and it's essentially why I wrote Coastal Convoy some years ago. In fact, a lot of years ago. The figure of 3,000 actually includes merchant sailors because that's lifted from the Commonwealth War Graves Commission database. So that's kind of that has all of them. There are merchant navy contributions in all sorts of different ways. So we talked about one example, the landing ships, which are the big converted liners that carry assault landing craft. So some of those are Red Ensign LSIs, so they are manned by merchant navy crews, probably the same crews that were manning them before the war when they were liners. You have merchant navy coasters. I'm really passionate about coasters. The coasters also proved capable of being put on a beach. So they would take the coasters over and they would put them on the beach and they could dry out on the beach. They're incredibly resilient little ships. And then they could be unloaded basically by cranes onto the beach, and then they'd refloat at high water and they'd go off. So the coasters are transformational. But then you have merchant sailors in supply ships. You have fuel tankers going out there. Merchant sailors are doing everything. There are peculiar, and forgive me, but I probably won't do too much detail on it, but they basically have to persuade the merchant navy sailors to sign up to a different contract to go into a war zone. So that's all quite complicated. Most of them do. And most of them are people who've been going through 5 years of war, either in the Atlantic or in coastal waters. I discovered that one of my little coasters that I covered in the Coastal Convoys book that was literally blown out of the water off Dover in 1940 and ended up on the rocks, had been refloated and continued to go around the coast for the rest of the war and went to Normandy and was dried out on the beach in Normandy. She was called Summity. So they're everywhere. They're absolutely everywhere.
And were those men eligible for the 1913?
Oh yeah, they yeah, absolutely, yeah. And that's a key difference. So just to rewind a little bit, in the First World War, the merchant navy doesn't exist. The merchant navy is a term for a bunch of people who are the employers of private businesses, and they have very limited recognition. And that's how they start the Second World War. And for a period of time, there's this appalling situation that the late Richard Woodman, who died recently and was a very dear friend of mine and is the historian of the merchant navy, told me about, which is, when they go in the lifeboat, their pay stops until they get a new ticket and they go to sea again and then they get paid again, which is absolutely shameful. But that gets corrected much earlier in the war, and by this point, they are absolutely treated as a service. And if you read Eisenhower's dispatch, he's fulsome in his praise for the merchant navy. There are American merchant sailors there as well, and there are American merchant ships too.
Thank you.
You're welcome. One and then one.
Yeah, I was interested that you were talking about a lot of German attacks with E-boats and submarines and other naval assets. Given that the Allies had control of the air, how did these manage to evade being destroyed? Because you would have assumed that if you've got control of the air, that nobody can move.
Because they come out at night, and for all we talk about absolute control of the air, it's still very, very, very hard to attack a small, fast-moving target at night. And they're getting better at it. And actually, perversely, I do talk about this quite a lot. The Fleet Air Arm is quite instrumental in this because they're very good at it. And the Fleet Air Arm are going out at night with albacores and swordfish, so biplanes, which are incredibly proficient rocket firing platforms. and they're going out looking for E-boats. But the distances involved are so short. They've only got to go from Le Havre into the fleet, attack something and go back again. So the response times aren't that there aren't enough aircraft that are capable of flying and hunting at night to just blanket the area with aircraft. And by the time you've called out, they've gone, they're back, they've gone back home. So it's that asymmetric warfare thing again. Even if you've got absolutely total control, you can't, the enemy has the initiative and you can't be strong everywhere all the time. So it is as simple as that. It's very similar to the Luftwaffe coming out. In the day, the Allies have this incredible fighter cover that the Germans essentially can't operate in. But at night, the number of night fighters, actually, aircraft that can be used at night diminishes. There's not that many of them. So it's a little bit easier for the Germans to come out at night. And sadly, naval anti-aircraft gunners are really rather more harm than good. There are numerous incidents of friendly fire and naval anti-aircraft gunners. And at one point, Ramsey tells all the merchant navy gunners and all the landing craft crews are not allowed to shoot at anything flying at all because the chances are they'll shoot at the wrong thing.
Thank you.
Hello.
Like you, I'm a massive fan of Ramsey. Ramsey eventually said in his diary that the biggest thing he worried about was mines.
Mm-hmm.
And he said if we were able to get to the far shore without suffering significant losses, being completely disorganised, we'd have been very fortunate. That was the case. We got through with remarkably few losses. Everyone got to where they should be on time. But as you've laid out very eloquently, this was far from a foregone conclusion. And yet, in the official history, Roskill says Ramsey was a lucky admiral, everything he asked for he got. And he even sort of lays the charge that the risks were exaggerated, the allocation of resources was excessive, and effectively the risks have been over-insured. It's an extraordinary charge to lay at Ramsey's feet. Not there to.
So Roskill. Sorry.
So the point would be part of the reason why I think this is such an undertold story. It's when the Navy's own official historian makes that charge.
I mean, the first question is why would you not over-resource something as important as this? This is the single most important operation of the war in the European theatre. It is if this fails, they're years away from being able to do it again. So firstly, why would you not over-resource it? That's a childish and ridiculous thing for Roskill to say. Roskill has spent much of the war fighting for resources for the Atlantic. He's a staff officer in that part of operations. So there is a frustration around that with Roskill. And also Roskill is, you always have to look at the motives behind authors, including me. But Roskill is writing in the Cold War when he's trying to drum up a sense that anti-submarine warfare is the single most important thing. There's a huge Russian submarine fleet, which if we're not careful is going to do to us what the Germans did to us in the war. So he comes at it from that perspective. I don't believe the threat was exaggerated. I think the threat was neutralised and dealt with. The Germans do make some fairly serious mistakes. There is a political imperative, which in Nazi Germany means it was Hitler personally who instructs them not to use those pressure mines until the invasion has been launched. And actually, really, they could have been devastating because if they'd been seeded, the Germans know when they're going to come. They're not stupid. They've got a rough idea where they're going to come. They don't know the precise date, and there's very strong voices for the Pas-de-Calais, but Normandy is, considered as a serious option. So that was a really big mistake. Those pressure mines could have massively disrupted the landing. They were ready for everything else. The Kleinkampfverband are a bit of a distraction. They don't really achieve much. More E-boats would have been absolutely devastating. The German surface fleet has pretty much ceased to exist by that point. But there is a plan, interestingly, that they have still got some assets left in the Baltic and Norway. And Ramsey has a plan, I can't recall the name of it now, but it is in the book, to pull together all the kind of old battleships and the heavy cruisers of the bombarding fleet and rush up the channel if the Germans come south with, I think they've got 2 pocket battleships and a couple of the cruisers left by this point and a pre-dreadnought. So there is this kind of wonderful plan, if you're into what-ifs, about an engagement somewhere in the southern reaches of the North Sea. But yeah, they over resource it because they need to, because it's so important. Hello, one and then one.
So surface fleet virtually non-existent, but submarine fleet still
Yeah.
very active. Why didn't they make more?
Well, they did. So
anyway?
the Germans assemble a submarine group in the Atlantic ports that is on standby for the invasion. So by this point, they'd been driven out of the North Atlantic. There is a recognition, they've lost the Battle of the Atlantic by this point. There is a recognition that the submarines that they have are not capable enough for modern submarine warfare. They're developing new boats. They're also fitting the older boats with this schnorkel device that allows them to run their diesels underwater. So they're trying to make the best of what is now an obsolete weapon. So they've pulled together this submarine group. When they know that the invasion is happening, they are sent out to do their job. They are absolutely decimated. The non-schnorkel, about half of them have got schnorkel. The non-schnorkel boats are just sunk or immediately driven back to port. They're complete, and then they're sent round to Norway to get refitted, because the schnorkel boats broadly survive, but they can't get anywhere near the invasion convoys. But they never stop until they start to lose those Atlantic U-boat bases, the Biscay bases. There are U-boat attacks on the spout all the time, but the U-boat force, it's not entirely spent. There are one or two incidents. There's one incident where a U-boat gets into a convoy and sinks 4 Liberty ships. So, they're still potent, but there's not enough of them, and they are coming to the end of their operational use. There's one guy, and if you read the book, it's in both my books actually, because it's sort of a coastal convoy story as well. He actually comes under serious depth charging attack trying to get into one of these convoys down the spout. Loses his bearings completely. The boat's been hammered to hell. He's crawling along the seabed. He gets out from trouble and gets to what he thinks is Jersey, pops up to periscope depth, has a look round, and he's in the Solent, which is probably the most heavily defended stretch of water. His name is Cortez, actually. The most heavily defended stretch of water, probably in the world at this point. So he puts his periscope down, and he goes as deep as he can, and he actually gets home. Because his report survives, and that's how we know that's what happened to him. Sadly, he was then subsequently killed. But the U-boats are there, but they're spent force, really.
Well, it's really a follow-on to that, because there was something called Operation Cork, which I believe was coastal command operations to send off both ends of the channel against U-boats.
So it's all joined up. So you've got multiple. They strip the Atlantic and the Arctic of anti-submarine escort groups and support groups for Normandy. The Russians are kind of not happy, but they understand, because they've been banging on about having a second front for years. So you've got these anti-submarine groups in the western approaches, and then you've got Coastal Command doing all the stuff that they used to be doing out in the Atlantic. And so it's a solid belt, and they again, I can't recall the statistic, but it is in the book. They sweep particular patches of ocean something like 9 or 10 times a day. They're just constantly, so it's almost impossible for the submarines to operate, because there's so much stuff. It's so much easier hunting submarines in a congested bit of water like that than out in the Atlantic. Although what the U-boats get very proficient at doing, the good ones, the clever U-boat skippers, they realise that this is different terrain, to use a military term, and they start hiding around wrecks and doing very clever stuff on the seabed, which makes it, as a sonar environment, it's really cluttered and really difficult to operate in. So they get the attrition rate isn't as bad as you think it is, but it's still virtually impossible for them to sink anything. They're just too busy trying to stay alive, really.
Does Operation Cork, does that phrase, that term, does that cover both Coastal Command and...
No, and actually I'm not familiar with Operation Cork, but it sounds to me like it's the Coastal Command bit of the same operation. Yeah.
Yeah, okay, that's interesting, yeah.
One over there, and then...
I'm interested in the close-range gunnery for the destroyers.
Yeah.
Because there's been a lot of controversy about how effective that was. So did they have the same maps of gun emplacements and obstacles that the landing troops had?
Yeah.
Had they coordinated with them very much? And did they have some sort of plan trying to take out the anti-tank guns that are enfilading the beach. Seems to cause a lot of-
So the enfilading batteries are a problem, and that's something that has not been fully understood. So because when you get aerial reconnaissance of a bunker, it's not necessarily particularly clear which way it's pointing. So that is a really significant issue. The naval officers, the commanders of the ships, they produce an extraordinary thing called a chart map, which combines the features of a naval chart and a topographical map that has all the features ashore as well as the normal things that they would need on a chart. So those are unique documents that are produced for Normandy, and they've all got those. So they've got an understanding of what they're looking at. They have an incredibly good intelligence picture of the things that are obvious. But have they got a picture of absolutely everything? No, of course they haven't. And actually, if the Germans have, as they did, converted a house into a blockhouse, that's really quite a hard thing to pick up on unless some enterprising member of the French resistance actually sees it. And bearing in mind the coastal strips in these places are pretty much a closed zone by this point in the war. So it's not 100, it's probably the best intelligence picture any invading force has been provided with, but it's not 100% complete. I'm interested in what you say about, so my understanding from all the sources I looked at is that naval gunnery at Omaha specifically you're talking about, I presume, is absolutely instrumental, and that's the official reports, but also the accounts of the guys ashore who are benefiting from this, that it's absolutely instrumental because they're coming in and they're firing over open sites. It actually doesn't matter what kind of a chart they've got, or it doesn't matter. They're communicating directly with the soldiers ashore and they're shooting at what they tell them to shoot at.
Are they radio contact?
No, they're visual signalling. That's how close in they are, and those are the risks they take. They do it in the British beaches as well. There's a very famous incident with a Free French destroyer that goes very, very close in at, I think, Sword, and is bombarding in support of the troops and runs aground. And their flotilla commander, who is British, sends them a wry little signal saying, how does it feel to be back on home ground? The history sadly doesn't record what the French commanding officer said in exchange, but you know they are doing very dangerous, tricky stuff, which could have put their ships in extreme peril.
I also have a vignette, which was that a friend of mine's father was a navigator on the Texas,
Oh, really?
and when they were exchanging 11-inch rounds, they did have a Dutch hit,
Yeah.
which he discovered after the battle when he walked into his stateroom and found an 11-inch dud in his stateroom.
Well, this is Cherbourg. that's the dud that hits the ship in Cherbourg. Yeah. I think is it that one that they've still got it? We digress, but they've still got it on display. I think one of the ships has still got.
Texas was never reconstructed. So she's basically a First World War dreadnought and sitting on stands in Texas.
She's on my bucket list, but we probably should talk about that afterwards.
Whereabouts in Texas?
She's moved now, hasn't she? She's got a new home. Yeah, she's just been very, very beautifully and expensively refitted because it was touch and go. She was in terrible condition, Texas, because I'm sorry, we're really digressing now. When they first took Texas there, nobody really understood that much about preserving ships, so they basically flooded out her bottom compartments and rested her on the riverbed, and that did not do her any good at all. And there was touch and go whether she was going to be saved, but they've done a beautiful job. I'd love to go and see her. Sorry, somebody had a question over here. Yeah.
Sorry, it's a comment rather than a question. As I understand it, going right back to the beginning, when the weather was dodgy, whether we were going to do it or not, and of course it all depended on the weather forecast. What we had done was, the Germans got their weather forecast from submarines based out in the West Atlantic, and we had taken all those out. So the Germans had no sense of what actually
No, they didn't.
really was. I just find it a lovely bit of real depth.
But even when because they did have they had secret weather stations on Greenland, and they had, so even the weather information they did get, because the Germans had a catastrophic failure to understand amphibious warfare. They had no idea how good the Allies were at it, and they didn't really have any idea how to do it themselves. You only have to look at the plans for Operation Sea Lion in 1940 to realise just how shambolic they were. And they're a land power. So the Germans thought the Allies couldn't come. And actually, very famously, a lot of the senior military commanders are at a tactical exercise, a war game in Rennes. Rommel's gone home for his wife's birthday. You know, they don't believe the Allies can come in this weather. So although it's strategically not a surprise, you can't hide an invasion of this size, it's a tactical surprise, and that's one of the big reasons why it's a tactical surprise. One there, one there, one there.
If you take the low point of planning as Dieppe or
Yeah.
everything was be there at 5 minutes, be somewhere else 2 minutes later, everything was potentially. You've got Torch, which you alluded to, had its problems, landing in Sicily in July.
Yeah.
Had its problems. Somehow everything came together for Normandy, and you look at the guys in Cossack, and they're one of the very few Anglo-American committees with the British guy whose name suddenly eludes me, I don't know why, and Barker, his second in command. They're appointed as a meritocracy, as the best people for the job. Is there a single person who you can say had learned from all those previous landings and was actually moving forward and got it right?
Well, I would say Ramsey, because I'm going to say that, but actually it's all of them, and I think actually it's not unique, and the genius of Eisenhower is Eisenhower, from the second he takes command in North Africa, it institutes a policy that this will be a unified Allied command, and there's never been anything like it in history before or since. It's seamless. It is the right person for the job, and all of the command teams, at the not just at the high strategy level, but right down, are joint until you get to those two forces, and then because there are different operational ways of operating, the Royal Navy has their bit and the US Navy has their bit. There are, and Eisenhower is ruthless in stamping out anyone who plays the nation card all the way through. There's an interesting point about the American Navy tactical doctrine is very much you issue this is what's taught in the Naval War College. You issue a general instruction, and then it's up to the commanders afloat to deliver it. The Royal Navy goes down the route of more explicit instructions. The US Navy are horrified by Ramsey's 1,000-page orders. Ramsey's argument, and I do think it is the right one, is that it's all very well in the Pacific, but you've got 7,000 ships in a very congested bit of water. You cannot afford to have everybody making it up as they go along in that space. So they are micromanaged down to the nth degree. That's not the way the British always do things, but it's seen as the right solution for this operation, which is incredibly challenging. And the other thing they do is they accept that you can learn. So they're not firing people when things go wrong. They have learnt from those experiences. Dieppe's a really good example. People still argue about some people argue that Dieppe did precisely what it was supposed to do, which was prove whether you could take a port or not. Personally, I think it's a very expensive way of learning that lesson, but the Canadian official history says that. So it is an interesting one. Quite like to write about Dieppe one day. But Dieppe is hugely under-resourced, and the other than the don't take a port, the big lessons from Dieppe are shore bombardment. There's nowhere near enough bombarding ships. They've got like 12 destroyers at Dieppe or something. And then there is control of gunfire from ashore. There's the importance of cheap, throwaway gunfire support landing craft. All of that stuff comes out of Dieppe, so it's really important. And then you go through the Mediterranean and you get, in North Africa, they don't know what they're doing, frankly, but the Vichy French are not massively enthusiastic opponents. They certainly don't know what they're doing in surf. It could have been awful, but it wasn't. For Sicily, they've got all the building blocks there, but they don't know how to use them, and that's why things go wrong. Avalanche, they get everything right, but the German opposition is horrific. I mean, really fierce opposition. They need, Salerno. But all of those things together means that they're incredibly proficient by the time they get to Normandy. So they've all learnt it, even down to kind of matelots on ships have been through 2 or 3 of these landings by this point. I'm sorry, we had a queue, but there's this gentleman, this lady, and that. Yeah.
Obviously, there was a lot of gallantry, individual acts. Generally, was there good recognition of the contribution of the naval element, and or was it just you were there, side campaign medals? How did they do it?
No, there's excellent recognition at the time, and if you read Eisenhower's dispatch, he is absolutely fulsome in his praise of the naval services, and that we couldn't have done any of this without the sailors. The problem is the naval services, and I would include the US Navy in this, not just the Royal Navy, they lose the Battle of the Memoirs. So Ramsay dies in 45. Don Moon kills himself in the Mediterranean from the US side because he's just burnt out, utterly burnt out. Vian writes a memoir that is terrible. It's so short, and it's mostly about dashing stuff with destroyers in the Mediterranean and Norway, and there's nothing in it. So on the other hand, you have Montgomery churning out, the story. Eisenhower, who wants to be president, writes big memoirs. So very rapidly, the Battle of the Memoirs becomes all about the soldiers, and the soldiers win it. And that's a big part of it. But at the time, there's absolute recognition of the importance of what the sailors are doing, and recognition of the fact that they're putting their lives on the line. They're not just taxi drivers.
In awards as well.
Yeah, I mean, there are awards, absolutely, insofar as, the British are always famously a bit more stingy with awards than the Americans are, but there are awards. Yes, there are. And Ramsay gets what does he get? He gets a knighthood for this. In fact, I was reading in some of the stuff I'm doing for the Mediterranean, he's put up for a knighthood in the Mediterranean, and it's basically not back because they go, hang on, he's going to have to do lots of other things yet. Don't give it him now, because what are we going to give it him? So I think he gets a mention to dispatches or something. So there are awards, yeah, absolutely. Have this lady and then somebody at the back.
On a very human level, I'm very intrigued by your friend Booth. Was it Booth?
Yeah, Jim Booth.
And in his submersible. Tell us a little bit about what.
So Jim Booth, who sadly passed away now, but he reached 100. Jim was a member of what they call the Combined Operations Pilotage Parties. So they're doing a lot of that beach survey and reconnaissance work. They are trained to go ashore clandestinely, gather samples, measure gradients. They do all sorts of other sneaky beaky stuff as well. There are other people doing this. The Royal Engineers are doing this as well. His role on D-Day itself was the British had 2 X-craft miniature submarines with their own crew and then a couple of coppists on board as well. And their job was to mark with a light and a flashing acoustic signal as well, the extreme western and eastern edges of the British invasion area, the Eastern Naval Task Force area. So Jim is in one of these X-craft. But because they're so slow, they go out anticipating D-Day on June 5th. And because they're so slow, they go out 2 days before that. So they're existing on dextrose tablets and foul air. He was fascinating to talk to. They got their they had to give them additional oxygen supplies because they couldn't really surface. They could come up at night, but they're so close to the shore that the single best means of carrying oxygen were oxygen cylinders recovered from crashed German bombers. So every time a German bomber went down, they were taking these things and storing them because they were really good little lightweight aluminium. So they were on oxygen. They were also taking amphetamines, I think, and really bad food, and living in a can for, I think, 5 days in the end. And then they do get the sheer joy of popping up and seeing the entire fleet coming in past them, and then they're taken off and they get to sleep, and a passage crew takes the boat back. They do a remarkable job. The Americans are offered them, but they don't want them. They decline a lot of the sort of British kind of gadgets. They have limited patience for that. But they do a really important job. They've famously, one of them, I think it was the one that Jim was in, was flying an enormous white ensign, partly out of pride, but partly because you're in something very small and you don't want to get run over by a landing ship. And I had the sheer joy.
It's got no profile, does it?
That's
X-craft.
just it. And I had the sheer joy of when I went to go do the primary source research, and I was going through the archival stuff. There was Jim in the reports, they were the dinghy officers. So what they were supposed to do, the COP guys, was from the X-craft, they were supposed to take a dinghy and go even further inshore and show another light. So you'd have the X-craft here and the dinghy there, and he was the dinghy officer. And he's referred to in the report because which is by the commanding officer of the X-craft, basically saying the dinghy officer was very enthusiastic to go and do his job, and I wouldn't let him, basically, because the weather was still too marginal and he just thought it was a waste of time. So Jim was very frustrated about that. And then when we did the filming, this is a personal dit now, but we did this filming in this submersible. Does anyone know the movie The Abyss? It was Cab 1 in The Abyss. I've been down in Cab 1. Anyway, we went down to look at this ship, and Jim was so excited. I was supposed to be interviewing him. I got nothing usable at all because he was so excited. So we then had the next day, we cheated the whole thing, and they dangled us off the back and put us just far enough down to lose the natural light, where there was nothing exciting to look at. And then I was able to get an underwater interview with him. So he was a remarkable human. I could talk about Jim a lot, but yeah.
Did you see the footage, Nick, which he showed me when I went to speak to him?
Oh yeah, because he was from your neck of the woods. He was Devon somewhere, wasn't he? I think.
He's
in the West Country somewhere.
Taunton, I think.
Yeah,
Taunton he lives in today. But I'm sure you've seen it. It's a well-known bit of footage of the X-Craft coming back to the command ship, and you can see him on deck as they're tying off, and it's pretty remarkable.
And they're only like a foot of freeboard. These things. Yeah. They're really. And they're standing on the quay. There's no rail. We think you have a rail, and none of that. You're just standing on a flat deck on something the size of a canoe. Sorry, you've been waiting really patiently.
Last question before we break.
You know, there's a lot of amphibious warfare in the Pacific.
Yeah.
To what extent did they manage to cross, to get the knowledge across the Atlantic?
Oh, do you know what? This is a great question. I wish we'd had this a bit earlier, but I'll try. Can I just do a couple? I know everyone's hungry. What they bring across from the Pacific is a lot of arguing, because the US Navy have evolved an entirely different doctrine for doing amphibious landings in the Mediterranean, in the Pacific, to the British in the Mediterranean. And what the US Army have learnt in Europe is Royal Navy doctrine. So you don't just get the British and the Americans fighting. The US Army goes to war with the US Navy, and it comes from a fundamental lack of understanding about the difference between these theatres. What the Americans do in the Pacific, if they're going to take an island, is they bombard it for weeks. They flatten it. You can do that with an island because you can cut it off and you can't reinforce it. So the British are going for surprise, which means a short bombardment really for just a matter of hours before you land. And there are good reasons for both those things, but there does seem to be a willful failure to understand each other's problems, or the lack of applicability from one to the other. So when the US Navy arrive, the US Navy aren't there initially, so this isn't a problem, but when the US Navy come over bringing that experience and that doctrine, there are significant arguments mostly about the length of bombardment. There's a guy called Lewis who's written a book called Omaha Beach, and he goes into this in great detail, and it's a really interesting read, actually. I think it's just called Omaha Beach Flawed Victory, I think it's called. It's a very good read. There's a lot to say about it, actually, but mostly that's what it comes down to, is a lot of what they do in the Pacific. It's not applicable, actually. The distances are far greater, so they have to, you have to take everything with you. You can't go back to port and re-ammunition. There's almost nothing from the Pacific other than putting the troops ashore that is relevant. There are some things like you get into arcane arguments online about whether they should have had LVT Buffalo amphibians at Normandy and whether they would have been any use. It doesn't matter. US Navy aren't releasing them from the Pacific anyway, so it's a pointless argument, really.
Okay, we'll break there. Thanks.
I have to say that's probably the